When Whitney Houston pushed open the heavy wooden doors of New Hope Baptist Church that autumn afternoon in 2010, she expected to find dust and memories. What she found instead would shake her to her core and remind her of who she really was beneath all the fame, pain, and broken promises. If you've ever felt like you've lost your way, if you've ever wondered if success is worth the price you paid, then Whitney's story that day will touch something deep in your soul. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This is the kind of story that changes how you see everything. The old church on Central Avenue in Newark looked nothing like the vibrant sanctuary Whitney remembered from her childhood. Paint was peeling from the once proud facade. Several windows were boarded up, and weeds had claimed the small garden where she used to pick flowers for her mother before Sunday service. Whitney sat in her black Mercedes for a full 10 minutes, staring at the building that had shaped the first 8 years of her life, before cancer took her away from this place. She hadn't planned this visit. Whitney had been driving aimlessly through Newark after another difficult therapy session, trying to make sense of the pieces of her life that seemed impossible to put back together. Her comeback album had received mixed reviews. Her voice wasn't what it used to be, and the constant pressure to prove herself again was overwhelming. That's when she'd found herself on Central Avenue, pulled by some invisible force toward the place where it all began. The heavy doors creaked as she pushed them open, and the familiar smell hit her immediately. Old wood, candle wax, and something else she couldn't quite place. The sanctuary was dimly lit, with late afternoon sunlight filtering through the few remaining stained glass windows. Empty pews stretched before her like silent witnesses to decades of prayers, baptisms, and Sunday morning services that had once filled this space with life. Whitney walked slowly down the center aisle, her designer heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. Each step brought back memories so vivid they took her breath away. She could almost hear 8-year-old Whitney singing Amazing Grace from the front row, her voice pure and untrained, but filled with the kind of faith that moves mountains. She paused at the third pew on the right, the Houston family pew, where she had sat every Sunday, between her mother Sissy and her cousin Dion. She could still feel her mother's gentle hand on her shoulder during prayer. Still remember the way Sissy would whisper, "Sing from your heart, baby," just before Whitney would stand to perform her solo. The memories were so real she could smell her mother's perfume mixing with the scent of the flowers that always adorned the altar. This was where she had learned that her voice was more than just sound. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Sunday after Sunday, she had watched grown men weep during her performances of His Eye is on the Sparrow and seen elderly women raise their hands toward heaven when she sang Precious Lord. Even as a child, she had understood that something special happened when she opened her mouth to sing in this sacred space. But what happened next would change everything Whitney thought she knew about destiny, gratitude, and the people who shape us when we're too young to understand their importance. As she approached the altar, Whitney heard something that made her freeze in place. It was music, faint and hesitant, but unmistakably coming from the old upright piano that sat to the right of the pulpit. Someone was here. Someone was playing the same melody she remembered from her childhood, the gentle warm-up scales that Mr. Samuel Washington used to play before choir practice. Whitney's heart started racing. Mr. Washington had been the church pianist when she was little, a kind, dignified man in his 50s who always wore a pressed white shirt and spoke to children like they were the most important people in the world. He was the first person who ever told her she had a special gift, the first person to use the word angel when describing her voice. Moving quietly toward the piano, Whitney could see a figure hunched over the keys. The man was much older now, his hair completely white, his shoulders bent with age. He wore clothes that looked like they'd seen too many nights outdoors, a faded jacket, worn shoes, pants that hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight. But those hands on the piano keys, those hands still moved with the same gentle grace she remembered. "Mr. Washington?" Whitney's voice was barely a whisper. The playing stopped abruptly. The old man turned slowly, and when his eyes met Whitney's, 50 years seemed to collapse into a single moment. His face, weathered and lined now, broke into a smile that was exactly the same as the one that used to greet her every Sunday morning. "Whitney? Little Whitney Houston?" "Child, is that really you?" What Whitney did next surprised even herself. Instead of keeping her distance, instead of the polite small talk that usually filled such encounters, she rushed to him and wrapped her arms around the man who had first told her she was special. And as she held him, she realized he was trembling, not from emotion, but from cold. "Mr. Washington, what are you doing here?" I thought. "I mean, don't you have a place to—" The old man's eyes filled with a sadness that cut straight through Whitney's heart. "Oh, child, life has a way of bringing us full circle, doesn't it? This old church has been my home for a while now. The congregation couldn't afford to keep me on, and well, my apartment got too expensive for a man with no steady income." Whitney felt something break inside her chest. Here was the man who had nurtured her gift when she was just a little girl, with a big voice and bigger dreams. And he was living as if he were forgotten by the world. The guilt hit her like a physical blow. She had made millions from the voice he had helped her discover, but she had never thought to check on the people who had been there at the beginning. "Mr. Washington, how long have you been staying here?" "About 6 months now," he said gently, as if he were discussing the weather rather than his own homelessness. "The current pastor is a good man, but the church is struggling financially. He doesn't know I stay here overnight. I slip in during the day when the doors are unlocked and leave before morning service on Sundays." Whitney couldn't speak. The man who had taught her that music was a gift from God was sleeping on wooden pews, and she had been so lost in her own struggles that she had never even thought to look for him. "I kept following your career, you know," Mr. Washington continued, his voice filled with pride that somehow made Whitney's guilt even worse. "Every Grammy, every album, every movie. I used to tell people, 'That's my little Whitney. I taught her her first scales right here at this piano.' I prayed for you during the difficult times, child. I prayed that you would remember where your gift came from." The weight of his words settled over Whitney like a blanket made of all her failures and forgotten promises. She had achieved everything she had ever dreamed of and more, but she had lost sight of the people who had believed in her before she believed in herself. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, and it would remind Whitney of a truth she had forgotten in the chaos of fame and expectations. "Mr. Washington, would you play something for me? Like you used to when I was little?" The old man's face lit up with a joy that made him look decades younger. He turned back to the piano and began playing the opening chords of Amazing Grace, slowly, carefully, with the same gentle touch Whitney remembered from her childhood. But when he began to sing, his voice cracked and wavered with age. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound." Without thinking, Whitney joined in, her voice blending with his in the empty sanctuary. "That saved a wretch like me." As they sang together, something magical happened. Whitney's voice, which had been strained and uncertain in recent performances, found its strength again. Not the powerhouse sound that had made her famous, but something even more precious. The pure spiritual sound that had first emerged in this very sanctuary 30 years ago. "I once was lost, but now am found." Tears were streaming down both their faces now, but they kept singing, their voices filling the empty church with the kind of music that speaks directly to the soul. "Was blind, but now I see." When the song ended, they sat in silence for a long moment. Whitney realized that she had been running from the very foundation that had made her strong, and in trying to meet everyone else's expectations, she had forgotten the simple truth that Mr. Washington had taught her as a child. Her voice was a gift meant to heal, starting with herself. "Mr. Washington," Whitney said finally, her voice steady for the first time in months, "you're not staying here anymore. You're coming with me." "Child, I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Whitney interrupted gently. "This is gratitude. This is me remembering that none of this," she gestured to herself, to everything she represented, "none of this would exist without people like you who saw something in a little girl and told her she was special." What happened next would become one of the most meaningful chapters in Whitney's life, though she would never speak about it publicly. Whitney spent the next hour listening to Mr. Washington's story, how the church had struggled financially after the neighborhood changed, how his small pension wasn't enough to cover rising rents, how he had been too proud to ask for help but too faithful to stop coming to the place where he had served God for 40 years. "The thing is," he said, "I wasn't angry about my circumstances. I knew God had a plan. I just didn't know what it was until you walked through those doors today." As he spoke, Whitney found herself thinking about all the nights she had slept in luxury hotel suites around the world, all the times she had complained about room service or demanded specific brands of bottled water. Here was a man who had given his life to service, sleeping on hard wooden pews and grateful for the privilege. The contrast wasn't lost on her, and it filled her with a determination she hadn't felt in years. That evening, Whitney made a series of phone calls that would change both their lives. First to a realtor about finding Mr. Washington a small, comfortable apartment, then to her financial advisor about setting up a monthly allowance that would ensure he never had to worry about basic necessities again. Finally, to the current pastor of New Hope Baptist Church about funding the renovations needed to restore the building to its former glory. But the most important call she made was to her own soul, a promise to never again forget the people who had planted the seeds of her success. The next morning, Whitney drove Mr. Washington to see the furnished one-bedroom apartment she had secured for him just a few blocks from the church. It was modest but comfortable, with a small piano by the window where he could practice and compose. "Whitney, child, I don't know how to thank you," he said, tears in his eyes as he sat down at the piano and played a few notes. "You already did," Whitney replied, "yesterday, when you reminded me who I really am." Over the following weeks, Whitney found herself visiting Mr. Washington regularly. They would sit at his piano and he would play while she sang. Not for audiences or critics or recording contracts, but simply for the joy of making music with someone who understood that her gift had always been about more than entertainment. During one of these visits, Mr. Washington shared something that would stay with Whitney for the rest of her life. "You know, Whitney, when you were a little girl, your mother used to worry that your gift was so big it might overshadow your spirit. I told her then what I'm telling you now. Your voice isn't meant to make you famous. Your voice is meant to remind people that they're not alone in this world." Those words helped Whitney understand why her recent performances had felt hollow. She had been singing for approval, for validation, for proof that she could still be the Whitney Houston the world expected her to be. But sitting in Mr. Washington's small apartment, singing the hymns they both remembered from decades ago, she rediscovered why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. The renovation of New Hope Baptist Church began in December 2010. Whitney insisted on being involved in every detail, from the restoration of the original stained glass windows to the installation of a beautiful new piano, a gift specifically for Mr. Washington to use when the church reopened. But the renovation wasn't just about the building. Working on this project gave Whitney a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't trying to prove anything or live up to any expectations. She was simply giving back to the place that had given her everything. The church reopened in the spring of 2011 with a small, intimate service that drew former congregation members from across the city. Whitney sang that day, not because she was Whitney Houston, but because she was a member of the community that had shaped her. As she stood at the front of the restored sanctuary, looking out at faces young and old, Whitney saw Mr. Washington at the piano, his hands steady and sure on the keys. She sang Amazing Grace again, but this time it wasn't a performance. It was a prayer of gratitude for being found when she didn't even know she was lost. After the service, a young girl approached Whitney, maybe 8 years old, with wide eyes and a shy smile. "Miss Whitney, my grandmother says you're famous. Are you really famous?" Whitney knelt down to the child's level, remembering how it felt to be that age, full of questions and dreams. "Sweetheart, what matters isn't whether I'm famous. What matters is whether I'm kind, whether I'm grateful, and whether I use my gifts to help others. Do you understand?" The little girl nodded solemnly, then brightened. "My teacher says I sing pretty good. Maybe someday I can sing in church like you." "I think you can do anything you set your mind to," Whitney said. "Just remember to always say thank you to the people who help you along the way." As Whitney watched the child skip back to her grandmother, she realized that Mr. Washington had given her something far more valuable than her first music lessons. He had given her a reminder that success without gratitude is just noise, and that the most beautiful voices are those that lift others up. The last time Whitney visited Mr. Washington was just a few weeks before her death in 2012. He was sitting at his piano, playing a song he had written for her, a gentle melody that captured everything he had always seen in that little girl with the enormous voice. "Whitney," he said as she prepared to leave that day, "I want you to know that finding you in that church was the answer to a prayer I'd been carrying for 30 years. I always wondered if I had made a difference in your life. Now I know that we made a difference in each other's lives." Whitney hugged him tightly, holding on to this man who represented everything pure and good about her journey. "Mr. Washington, you didn't just make a difference in my life. You saved it. You reminded me that my voice was never really mine. It belongs to everyone who needs to hear it." When Whitney Houston passed away in February 2012, Mr. Samuel Washington was among the small group of people who spoke at a private memorial service before the public funeral. His words were simple but profound. "That little girl who used to sing in our church never left us. Fame and fortune and all the troubles that came with them. Those were just things that happened to Whitney. But the Whitney we loved, the one with the voice of an angel and the heart of a servant, she was still there. I saw her that day when she came back to the old church, and I see her now every time someone uses their gifts to help another person." Today, New Hope Baptist Church continues to serve its community with a beautiful plaque by the piano that reads, "In memory of Whitney Houston, who never forgot where her song began, and Samuel Washington, who taught us all that the greatest gifts are those we share with others." Mr. Washington, now 80, still plays piano at the church every Sunday. When children in the congregation show musical talent, he gives them the same encouragement he once gave a little girl named Whitney Houston. "Child, you've got something special. Don't forget to say thank you to God, and don't forget to use it to help others." The story of Whitney's return to New Hope Baptist Church reminds us that success means nothing if we forget the people who believed in us before we believed in ourselves. It teaches us that sometimes we have to go back to where we started to remember who we really are. Whitney Houston may have been known as the Voice, but Mr. Samuel Washington knew her simply as the little girl who never forgot to say thank you. In the end, perhaps that's the most beautiful song of all. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of gratitude and the importance of never forgetting our roots. Subscribe for more stories about the heart behind the music, and let us know in the comments about someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself. Sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that take us home. Today, visitors to New Hope Baptist Church often ask to sit in the third pew on the right, Whitney's family pew, and many say they can still feel the spiritual energy she left behind. The church has become more than just a place of worship. It's a testament to the power of coming full circle and remembering where we came from. Mr. Washington, now in his 80s, has become something of a legend in Newark. Young musicians from around the city seek him out for piano lessons, drawn by the man who nurtured Whitney Houston's gift. He always tells them the same thing he told Whitney: "Your talent is a loan from God. Use it to pay forward the kindness you've received." The foundation Whitney quietly established continues to support struggling musicians and renovate churches in underserved communities. She never wanted credit for this work, instructing her lawyers to keep her donations anonymous. But Mr. Washington always knew. "That's just who Whitney was," he often says. "Famous to the world, but humble to her core." This story reminds us that true success isn't measured by album sales or awards, but by the lives we touch and the gratitude we carry. Whitney Houston may have been known for her voice, but those who knew her best remember her for her heart. In a world that often forgets its heroes, Whitney made sure the man who believed in her first would never be forgotten.